Welcome to the Balance Sheet, where you rise above the noise and learn about the most important business issues of our age. I'm your host and fellow student, Conrad Chua. Many students I meet come to business school to make a change in their career. They're all a bit unhappy with their status quo, and I'm wondering how to make that big change, how to go on to the next stage of their career. So, how do you prepare for that leap? How do you calculate the risk? We have today with us someone who's made multiple career transitions. Wan Hong is a CJBS MBA alum, and she's worked in New York, London, Italy, Cairo, and she's now in Nairobi. So she's made so many changes in terms of the countries she's worked in, but also the industries. She was in financial services and consulting, and now she's working in the social sector. So thank you. So please join me in welcoming Wan today. Welcome, Wan.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Conrad. So great to be you all today.
So Wan, can you start by telling us about your career?
Sure, absolutely. I'm Wan. I'm originally from Taiwan. I was a pretty local kid, and then I decided to go for university in the US, which then sort of transitioned me into a much more kind of international experience. I moved around, and like Conrad mentioned, I'm calling in today from Nairobi. Um, My career probably could be categorized into three different trenches over the years. The first one was pre-MBA, which I was mostly focused on financial services. I qualified as a CPA. I worked in audit in a Big Four accounting firm, and as well as in FP&A in a hedge fund. But I realized that I wanted to kind of understand the business beyond just the financial aspects of it, and so that's when I decided to join the MBA. And that sort of transitioned me into the second part of my career, which was very focused on consulting and strategy consulting with McKinsey in London. And I focused primarily on consumer-facing sectors, which includes things like retail, food, as well as travel and toys. Actually, it's a wide range of activities when you work in consulting. But I really like the fact that it was super international. It brought me to lots of different clients in Europe and Asia. And also it kind of allowed me to understand that I am much more interested in things that are really tangible. Yet at the same time, I am more interested in areas that perhaps less commercial oriented, which sort of kickstarted my third part of my career, which is kind of what we're going to be talking about today, primarily focused on the social sector. I realized that I was much more motivated as a person by working on mission-oriented, impact-oriented topics, and therefore kind of reflecting on it, I ended up joining the United Nations World Food Program in Italy, which is where the headquarters is based on strategic issues, and then moved with them to Cairo, working on external partnerships. Following that, I went to the International Rescue Committee, which is one of the world's largest international NGO focused on humanitarian assistance as well, as Senior Director for Policy and Planning, which looked at a range of issues, both kind of strategy, management, but also external facing engagements. That kind of cemented my desire to really focus the rest of my career in this sector. And I have recently moved to Nairobi, Kenya, and focused on social sector work continuously. I've been most recently with a social enterprise startup, and I will soon be joining a foundation. So that's the range of activities, and happy to go in any of the directions today.
Wan, can you tell us a little bit more about the whole sector, whether it's international organizations or social enterprises? Because it sounds like it encompasses a huge range of organizations, both in terms of the work that the causes that they serve, but also the global reach that they have.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good way to start the conversation today because social sector means a lot of different things and also means a lot of different things to different people. And it's helpful to frame the conversation a little bit because this is such a big space. I would say the common thread today are we're talking about organizations that are mission and positive social change oriented. And under that umbrella, there are many different ways that you can be involved. For example, it could be kind of more traditional public sector, government roles, but also NGOs, nonprofit, development sectors. All of those are something that we can touch on today. My personal experience is much more focused on the NGO and nonprofit, with a little bit most recently on social enterprise, but that's not the entire sector. And I really like that we kind of open up the space a little bit because when I was in MBA, like this is kind of a harder to understand sector, perhaps from an outside perspective. And once I started working in one part of the organization, it helped me actually understand, okay, beyond the UN, there's other NGO space, there's the localized ones, there's the international ones, as well as those that are focusing on more policy and development and economic, as well as those who are focused on assistance, for example, and humanitarian disaster relief. And so that range is huge, but it oriented around impact, change, social good is the type of organizations.
Wan, you came to Cambridge, you did your MBA, and then you went to work for one of those firms that MBAs all over the world really want to work for, McKinsey. You got to work with lots of great clients. So what inspired you to make that move from consulting to the not-for-profit or the NGO sector?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think it's always been part of me. I think throughout my career, I did a lot of kind of volunteering and working with youth education or working on kind of student social enterprise idea generation programs. And what I didn't know at the time is how to figure out a viable career path, perhaps. And so a lot of it is trial and error. A lot of it is kind of exploring and kind of just like try things and figure out if that's fitting in the right place. And so when I joined the MBA, I already know that I'm interested in exploring the nonprofit areas, but I perhaps didn't know specifically around how or where. So one of the reasons I picked Judge is because Judge had all the concentrations that are beyond the more traditional paths of strategy and consulting, and actually had things like culture and arts management and sustainability. And those are issues that I'm interested in exploring. So as a MBA choice, I thought that was great for me to have the opportunity to explore. And I actually did my concentration in culture and arts management. And what it taught me was that a lot of the issues that the nonprofit organizations are facing are in some ways similar to the business challenges. It's around how do you make the best use of resources. It's around how do you bring people around a mission. There are different considerations within that, but I think the Cambridge experience was wonderful, and it was my favorite part of the MBA to do the culture and arts management concentration that allowed me the kind of open up the imagination of like, it's possible with a business background, we can also kind of look at ways of contributing to issues that are beyond the commercial aspects. That said, when I first finished the MBA, I joined McKinsey, and I think it was somewhat accidental. It was an interesting career. I loved the freedom of trying out different sectors, working with different clients in different international geographies. And I also like the fact that you can kind of change and work on different issues. And I also know that it would be a good training for me coming from a purely financial background, looking into broadening into kind of more general business management and strategy. So I joined McKinsey and had a really wonderful experience. It then helped me understand that in my personal definition, that when I'm looking at like kind of a long-term career on impact, the non-commercial space is more motivating for me. And therefore, when I decided to leave McKinsey, I took some time to reflect on it. I actually did a mini sabbatical, which I highly encourage everybody to do if you can at some point in your career, which then helped me kind of find the space to explore and evaluate where in the social sector I'm most interested in entering. And that's what brought me to the World Food Program, which is one of the world's largest humanitarian assistance organizations.
It's great that to hear that you had this passion and you felt this mission that you wanted to contribute to, but surely there was a big career risk that you were taking to move from McKinsey to the World Food Organization. How did you think about that? And if so, how did you balance or rationalize that career risk that you were taking?
Yeah, I think part of it is my personality. I enjoy something that is different and risky, and I think many times I'm actually more interested. I look at the risk elements of it as something like, what can I learn out of it, and how can I round out my experience differently? So perhaps that's a part of my personality that drives me to do something that is quite different each time. I think when I was a kid, I always remember my mom telling me things like, if you're given two options, pick the one that if you don't do it now, you can never do it again, and just try it out and see what happens. And so I think that stays with me a bit around as I was thinking about different career iterations. for me, what's important is understanding kind of what's the common thread for myself. And I know that I'm much more motivated by mission and impact. And from there, I think everything is somewhat interesting to try out and figure out how to make it a rounded experience, and take the learnings from the different elements. So it's a risk, but it's a calculated risk, I would say. And I think for me, the risk of joining from a consulting into a large international organization perhaps is not overcomable. There are very many similarities between many of the organizations, especially when you're looking at some of the larger non-governmental or governmental organizations. There are more similarities than you maybe would think. But I enjoy the fact that we're working on issues that I feel like have a positive social change.
And just a reminder to our viewers, you can put questions for Wan in the chats or comments, and we may not answer the questions in order. Wan, you mentioned that there's some similarities between an NGO and a large organization. What are some of these similarities?
Sure. So first of all, I think for any of the organization, whether it's commercial or non-commercial, there is you exist for a purpose, you exist for a reason. And so there's mission statement in every organization. And so the similarities for the NGOs and the for-profits are equally that they're trying to achieve something and strive for something. And so that's kind of being the driving force behind a lot of the decisions and a lot of your activities both exist. The second thing that I think is quite similar is around kind of organization needs to be able to function as a well-oiled machine. And so whether you're going for a for-profit or not-for-profit, being able to kind of make good decisions, be efficient, be effective in what you do are true in both sides. And I think just because it's something that isn't necessarily going for profit, it doesn't mean that a lot of these kind of more practical considerations go out of the way. It's actually very similar in order to function properly and be able to deliver what you set out to do. So those are probably two of the biggest similarities, I would say.
And what were some of the biggest difference in terms of that working cultures that you experienced going into an NGO?
Yeah, one is I think because of the goals are quite different, I think you get a lot more people that are intrinsically motivated by the mission of the organization. They find an organization that are aligned with their kind of personal beliefs and their personal goals, issues that they care about in the world. And so you do get a lot of people that have shared kind of values and shared motivation, and that's how they join the organization, which may or may not, sometimes it also exists in commercial space as well, but that's very much one of the uniting factors of people in some of the organizations in the not-for-profit space. Secondly, I think some of the decision-making factors might be different. It's less driven by profitability, and it's a lot around how can you create impact, how do you deliver in a very resource-limited way, making the most happen with the amount that you have. And thirdly, I think the type of organizations that I've worked with tend to be quite responsive and connected to world events, just by nature of kind of working on humanitarian development. You kind of are very connected to, emergencies and crises that are happening in the world, but also the policy making space that's kind of influencing our work. And those are probably less apparent, perhaps, in the more commercial operations. Personally, one of the differences that I find also is that even though I've worked in many international locations like London and New York before switching into this sector, I still find this space even more international in a way. I think it touches on a lot of locations and geography that maybe in a more commercial operation you wouldn't necessarily be exposed to. And also the people that I meet in this career has been a lot of movements. So today I'm in Nairobi, a couple of years ago I was in New York, a couple of years ago I was in Cairo, and the world sort of expands from there with a lot of people kind of moving around with the career. And so that adds a different flavor of international beyond kind of the MNC that you usually experience.
And we have a question from Yukino from Japan, who wants to know if you have any examples of how the global diverse network you built at CJBS helped you in your work in McKinsey and later on in international organizations.
Yeah, so two things I would say. One is I think when I was a judge, I think it's taking the time with a year to kind of explore being a student again mid-career and think about what you're interested in doing frees you up with a lot of kind of ability to get connected with people. And as a student, a judge, it just opens out a lot of doors. Like you kind of through whether it's official or unofficial curriculums or student networking, etc. I kind of went in with a very open mind of like, I'm not here to network to get to know someone specifically for a job, but I'm here to learn about what you're doing with your interesting life and career. And that brought a lot of kind of inspirations or kind of, oh, that sounds interesting to me, or okay, I don't think I want to do that. And it's just like an exploratory space. Being a student was really great. Secondly, I think it's not necessarily like and that's maybe perhaps my personal approach. I don't see it as like kind of like I must like network my way into a job, but through the conversations, it also kind of builds your own kind of vantage point around like what are the things that interest you, and who are the people that you might want to kind of reach out to just learn more beyond like a superficial initial conversation, and kind of seek advice from specific people. And I would say around the CJBS network, like people are really open in sharing their own experience. So once you've done like the first part of getting your own ideas generated, reaching out to people with the CJBS network to kind of get support, get ideas, like having a conversation to help you build out your own version of what you would like to do, that was actually really, really helpful. And with not specifically for McKinsey, but also like when we were there were a lot of alums who were willing to share their experience, come back on the Saturday sessions to kind of help us with case studies, etc. So there's just like a very collaborative nature of the environment that I thought was quite helpful.
Wan, you've worked in strategy roles, right? In the boardrooms of major private companies, and also with the president of the International Rescue Committee. So, what's the experience like, and are there differences in approach between an NGO and a private company when it comes to strategy?
Yeah. So perhaps it also is helpful to just kind of frame it a little bit with like what I did at IRC. So my role was the Senior Director for Policy and Planning, which kind of supports the President, CEO on all range of activities, both internal facing on management as well as external facing. And so that's the range of kind of strategic direction setting, identifying challenges and partnering with different parts of the organization for solutions. So that's the range of activities that I was privileged to work with. There are some things that I didn't personally do, for example, in the kind of more programmatic development or program implementation in specific countries, for example. So I had a more kind of HQ type role. And my observation from that particular perspective in terms of what is different, perhaps like I mentioned, very interestingly to understand that many of the things are quite similar. You are looking at how do you manage the organization better, how do you set strategy that directs the organization so that we are all working towards the same direction of travel. And the differences really lies around kind of issues that we are primarily concerned about, which in our case was focusing on how do we support those who are in a challenging crisis environment as fast and as efficient as possible. And another element of it is around resource allocations and resource management because of the challenging nature of working for a nonprofit. And so those are kind of issues that changes how you set the strategy, but you still have to have that long-term vision. What is your added value as an organization? What do you bring to the table? What's your reason to exist in a particular activity? And therefore it helps you make a go, no-go decision at the very, very kind of top-down level. Yet at the same time, you work very closely with every party of the organization to get the best out of the resources you have and bring people together around the vision. one thing that might be slightly different is kind of thinking about like in the sector, like unlike perhaps in a more commercial operation, many of your peers are more likely your direct competitors than your partners. Whereas like in a nonprofit sector, even though maybe organizations have different particular missions or goals that they're trying to achieve, generally speaking, there is much more of there's not enough resources to go around. And so we have to kind of see each other's value and partner and figure out kind of what's your and mine added value to the space. And so I think that level of partnership collaboration is a different kind of dynamic when you're thinking about setting strategies. This is not all about what do you do as an organization, but around how do you bring partners along. And related to that, there is an element around working with local partners who really know the context better and really can help reach all of the clients that you're trying to work with, and really kind of thinking about the power dynamic between different organizations and kind of open up the mindset and finding the best solutions for the scenario, as opposed to perhaps a more kind of traditional competitor type of a dynamic, which is quite different.
Wow. So what are some of the skills that you had to bring to play when you're thinking of building those sort of partnerships?
I think at an organizational level, there are different elements to consider. One is around kind of what is the skills and sort of niche that every organization is particularly strong in. So you have some that are focused very much on delivery and can do end-to-end logistics very well, but also some that are much more around policy design and policy influencing. And so that kind of role you play changes your contribution and the way kind of your position in a partnership. The second part of it also, I think, is around kind of how big or small your organization is and how kind of professionalized you are in certain elements. And so there may be things that are stronger in certain organizations around kind of financial management, like you just have more back-end support and operational capacity to take on a lot of the more practical aspects of it, whereas some of the organization may have a better reach to those in need and have a better understanding of kind of cultural dimensions that a different international organization may not be able to provide. And so those are the different skill sets that different organizations bring to the table. And I think at a personal level, it's quite similar as well in that like I come from a more business background than maybe many of my colleagues. And so there are complementary skill sets. For example, I'm perhaps someone that look at more strategy planning, kind of organizational structures, financial resources, etc., into a decision, whereas many of my colleagues have much more technical skills on economic development than I do. And so finding that complementary skill sets together is what makes a program or an organization much more successful at delivering the end goal.
We have a question from Joey. I think he's watching from Thailand. After transitioning into the social sector and working towards social causes, did you encounter any differences with regards to ethical standards, and how did you tackle them?
I would say that there's two parts of it. One is I think when I'm joining an organization, being aligned to the mission, the value, and the culture of the organization is a big part of for me in terms of deciding whether I'm going to join an organization. So in some ways, that was a bar that I really tried to maintain before I participate in an organization, and therefore, luckily, since I've joined, there hasn't been any kind of ethical dilemma in the kind of personal space that I then have to tackle, because I feel like that was one of the filtering questions at the early stages of me thinking about what organizations to take part in. But the second part of it is a lot of this, again, in terms of similar issues around kind of values and also putting safeguarding guardrails in the organization to help make sure there's no violation of ethical issues is true in both public and private sector. And arguably the standards should be higher in the public sector in terms of making the best use of public money and then making sure that we are doing no harm to the people that we're working with. And so organizations do spend a lot of time and effort in thinking about it and designing the right process and guardrails in place to support that. And so in some ways it's not so different, but personally I feel like the bar is a bit higher from my vantage point.
Yeah. Catherine asked, aside from your passion for impact, what do you feel was your main value that helped you get into this social sector?
Yeah. So one of the things that I would say is actually a lot of the skills from the business or strategy background that I had, I think still very much is useful for the organization, but might be missing in some of the organizations. So for example, a lot of what we would consider as good management, such as planning with like very, very thoughtful cycles around kind of the business timing and planning, or like looking at results, looking at KPIs. Things that are relevant in the business sector are also relevant for a public sector, but in kind of traditionally there may be less people focusing on that area. So coming with a business background helps with kind of instilling some of the similar kind of rigor and data, being more data driven, being more data oriented in a lot of the decision making really helps. And it is not to say that like the public or nonprofit sector didn't know about it in the past. I think they do, and there's a lot of also talent in the organizations as well, but it is relatively less of an focused area in the past. So like kind of bringing those elements in has been quite helpful, and kind of bring a different skill set, and just thinking about the big picture, thinking about kind of more strategic issues beyond direct program implementation is something that has been a role that I've played in the organizations.
That's an interesting sort of question, because I keep seeing that there's a perception that actually the social sector, NGOs, there's a lot that they can learn from the private sector, right? Is there things that you feel that the private sector could learn from NGOs and the social sector in terms of organization, in terms of strategy, in terms of execution?
One of the things I think is quite an interesting example is like in the most recent year, I've been working with a social enterprise, which is exactly trying to balance those two. It has a mission of working with the underserved, underserved by the commercial standard, with smallholder farmers that may be unbanked or unbankable or doesn't get approval for credits, etc., and trying to kind of work through financial inclusion issues that help smallholder farmers to look at different ways to grow their business. And so there is a very clear social mission behind it, but there's also a very clear commercial needs behind it. And so mirroring the two together has been an interesting experience for myself to kind of understand the challenges and the trade-off. Like we said, there are many things that are similar in a social enterprise. You also need to kind of balance the books. You need to hire the right people. You have to kind of make sure your operation is seamless and smooth. Yet at the same time, I think having a mission underlying all of your activities help you to have the clarity in when you're making tough decisions, tough trade-offs on what is the most beneficial, what does no harm, and what can you, when you need to prioritize, what are the areas that would help you really achieve what you're trying to do. So having that clarity, I think is quite helpful for a mission-driven organization that I think more commercial-oriented organization might learn from that. And the other element of it is also to understand that these things are not necessarily binary and they're not necessarily a choice. You can have a good idea and have a good business model working on something that is commercially oriented to help improve with a positive social impact. And that's maybe like in the commercial sector could think about as well. And of course, there's a lot of CSR activities, etc. But like, how do you embed that really in your like core business model is something interesting. Perhaps the commercial sector could think about more.
Can you talk a bit about your experience moving to Kenya and working on social enterprise startups?
Yeah. It's been a great experience. It's been a year, so I'm still very new, and so I can't say that I have all the learnings yet. But yeah, I joined Apollo Agriculture, which is a startup working with smallholder farmers, like I mentioned, and improving their returns and their P&L through a lot of financial inclusion, credit, and input and education programs. It's been really fulfilling experience for me to really kind of get to know the sector and the country. And there's a lot of field visits that we do, going into farmers' houses, sit down with many of their neighbors and talk through kind of how can they improve their own earnings and returns that would then help them have a better season, and then therefore have other chain effect of other economic opportunities, as well as education opportunities for their kids and their broader families. And so you can kind of see every one of them almost as a micro enterprise, and understanding their individual kind of business decisions on where to invest, where not to invest, how do they think of risk in terms of planting, etc. And those are really eye-opening experiences for me, given that I have not come from an agricultural background and is new to the country. And it also interestingly brought me to many parts of the country that I guess as a tourist you may not end up going to, that are much more kind of ag fertile lands that is beautiful and the wonderful experience so far. On a more broader, like kind of stepping back from the role that I've been playing, I think Kenya is an interesting and exciting but challenging market. There is a very strong and vibrant startup ecosystem and startup scene. Some of them with very explicit social change mission, but also many of them are looking for a commercially viable solution that will also kind of improve the economic status for many. So it's a growing and kind of very vibrant environment, which attracts lots of opportunities, local talents growing up, and I think it's highly professionalized, and it's been really great to be part of that ecosystem. I'll soon be moving to a different role in a different environment, in a foundation space, but it's still going to be working on SMEs, financial inclusion, and job creation for youth and women. And so I think Kenya kind of allows me to learn more from the market and learn more from the environment, which I'm enjoying.
How do you learn about a new country or a new sector like agriculture?
A lot of it is learning by doing. I think that's the beauty of a lot of the movements. I think there are a certain skill sets that I bring to the table. Some of the things we've mentioned from kind of a commercial background. There's another set of experience that I kind of can demonstrate that I can be adaptable and kind of flexible and nimble in lots of different culture or even geography that I've worked in. And so those are kind of baseline coming into it. Yet at the same time, I think getting involved, getting kind of roll up your sleeve and getting into the issues and is the best way to learn. Maybe echoing back to what we were talking about earlier around like when I was a judge, there was just like a lot of really great people and network that are very open-minded to share. And I would say every time I move in a different country or a different sector, there is a lot of wonderful people that have helped me along the way. And that a lot of it is through kind of genuinely me interested in learning about what they're doing and asking questions. And people are surprisingly or not surprisingly, pleasantly willing to share. And so there is a lot of goodwill that's built through that. And I try to do that for anyone who's moving to my space or my location or my environment as well. And if you're willing to be open-minded, there's a lot that you can learn from each other.
We have a question from someone on LinkedIn about precisely that. Did you use your status as a Cambridge Judge Business School alone to help you get into this sector when you had no background in NGOs or social sector?
So I wouldn't say it's like an explicit, I didn't call someone from CJBS and say, hey, there's no like direct alum connection that landed me in my first role. But I would say like generally speaking, having the MBA experience was very helpful in that it's a stamp of approval, but it's also kind of through the MBA year, I've broadened up my mind around kind of how a business degree can be useful in a nonprofit sector. So I think I can come into the conversations with a bit more insight, a bit more confidence, a bit more clued in than before my MBA. Even though it's not something like directly that says, hey, there's a person who is working in this and just call them and I landed a job. It's perhaps most of my roles that I have landed over the years have been really just kind of postings and job boards and kind of finding it, like going through the front door. But having networks of people who may or may not work directly in the space, but willing to kind of brainstorm with you or answer the questions on some level that help. And a lot of it is, like you said, without the background, without a specific international development or social sector background, some of it comes down to being a bit more creative around thinking about how to frame your experience to fit in a different environment or a different situation. Some of it comes down to being flexible and adaptable with the roles that are offered. And some of it comes down to kind of being able to connect the dots between things that I may have done, and even if it's not on the surface very directly related, but like finding a way to kind of connect the dots and see how things can come together to help support the transition.
We have another question from Joey, and I'm going to reframe it a bit. It's if there's someone who's working in the social sector who wants to go into McKinsey or consulting, are there transferable skills or experiences that such a person should emphasize?
Yeah, I think there are many. And I think the consulting space is one that is particular open-minded to people with different background. And so in many ways, it's a very viable path. Many of my colleagues at McKinsey came from public sector background or NGO, or even lots of professional athletes or professional writers. The range is beyond my imagination, and I thought my profile was definitely one of the more boring ones. And so that transition definitely works. I think the skill sets that would be interesting that is transferable. One is, I think there's a lot of international nature of a lot of the social sector work that very much kind of is required in a consulting space. Secondly, I think many of the social sector work actually is very client oriented and client focused. It may be a different kind of clientele, it may be a different kind of client challenge that you're facing, but it is around understanding what are the needs, how do you address them, how do you problem solve to provide a better solution. And so finding a way to kind of pick out some things that you've done that also is client oriented in that sense might help in kind of understanding how you might fit into it. And thirdly, I would say, is a lot of the soft skills are similar. You might need to have good data-oriented skill, good logic, good ability to engage with a broader audience, ability to work very fast and think on your feet. Some of these things are like sector agnostic. And so if you happen to be someone who works in social sector but utilize a lot of these skills, the consulting sector would also still be interesting and may look on it favorably.
So, Wan, did the MBA or McKinsey, was there something that they didn't prepare you for the current work that you're doing?
That's a great question. There are a lot of things that the MBA and McKinsey prepared me for, and I think some of it is the intensity has changed over the years. You know, like as a consultant and as an MBA, you think about how do you have the right adaptability? How do you connect with people, empathy? A lot of these things very much still is relevant in my work today. The two things that are probably slightly different and that they're actually surprisingly mostly personal. One, I would say, because the sector that I'm in is highly international, and I particularly picked a sub path that is more moving around involved. You can also do this in the government space and in one country, but I personally like that the sector offers so many international choices. It meant a lot of moving around, and that intensity is probably something that I had at the MBA and at McKinsey, but the level of complexity as you kind of move across country or cross continent every 2 years, it is a lot of life and logistics to sort. I'm glad that my job before prepared me with the kind of mental strength to keep doing it, but it is probably up a notch. The second thing is uh, there is a level of maybe more constant career rethink that is required than perhaps a more traditional um, um, path in a corporate world. So there is less of a very clear kind of you work in finance and you kind of work through the ranks, and there's like a defined set of activities that maybe you continue to do, and it will be very there's also challenges, of course, in every sector, but there's probably more of an expected route with a more corporate life. Whereas I think in the social sector, the permutations of different roles and different combinations of activities is quite a lot. And so for me, there is a level of constant stepping back and moving forward. I think, plus we are doing this as a couple. Me and my husband are both in the sector, and so there's a lot of considerations of how to make this work and balance the opportunities. So it is much more in the jungle gym, monkey bar type of analogy than maybe a straight up ladder. Personally, I very much enjoy it, but I think that is very different from my previous path.
So finally, Wan, what advice do you have for MBA students interested in following a career in social enterprises or NGO sector?
Yeah, one is I think really kind of open up to try and learn about what are the different elements of different elements of the sector and different organizations that you might personally be interested to be part of. Like we mentioned, there are many different ways to cut this. Public versus government, non-government. Another dimension is you can be in a social impact space that are still commercial. You can be in like impact investment VCs, kind of coming at it from a for-profit side. There's also another dimension, which is whether you're interested in policy or operations or delivery or humanitarian assistance. So these are so many choices that I think as a kind of new entry into it, spending time to understand what are the different components of it would be quite helpful for yourself to understand what angle you're most excited and driven by. The second part of it, I would say, is to figure out within that context what drives you, because a lot of this is around kind of you yourself aligning with the mission and the goals of the organization, and therefore kind of understanding yourself and understanding what part of it will make it a more sustainable career for yourself is quite important. And thirdly, I would say there are some challenges coming into the space. I personally took a bit of a step back when I first entered, and I'm not saying that that's always the case for everyone, but learning by doing is probably something that is quite relevant in this case. And so, you know, if you're really truly interested in coming into the sector and are finding it quite hard to come in with a role that meets all of your expectations, and I would say do it. You'll learn something. You'll build a reputation as someone who knows more than you did before the role, and that adds up to the next thing and the next thing. And I find that kind of practical experience in the sector is highly valued.
Thank you so much, Wan, for that wonderful journey through your career. And thank you also to our viewers. The balance sheet will be back in 2 weeks, 4th October at 12:45 UK time. We'll have Professor Robin Dunbar, who will talk about how to build and lead superb teams. So till then, stay well, and we'll see you next time.